What was the point of October 7th? When Hamas fighters broke through the barriers that divide the occupied lands of Israel from besieged Gaza, what did Yahya Sinwar and the other leaders who planned the Al-Aqsa Flood expect to happen? This is a crucial question for trying to understand the world of war that we find ourselves in as of early 2026, but it's one I bet a lot of y'all haven't really thought about all that much. It would be understandable if you haven't, because the media in the US and in the UK took for granted from the moment that the flood started that the goal was just to try to take out as many Israelis as they could, as though Hamas thought they could end 75 years of occupation and war and genocide in one fell swoop. You won't necessarily find this opinion stated explicitly anywhere, but it's kind of inherent to the lack of consideration for the broader context and the tense world of geopolitical factionalism which we live in. Rarely does this context come up in the US media especially. It didn't on October 7th, and it hasn't during the Gaza genocide. It's simply not considered that Hamas's plan would have involved anything except for short-term killing for its own sake. I'm not sure Hamas really expected to make it as far into the occupied lands as they did. They weren't realistically going to retake territory and hold it over any extended period of time, given the asymmetry between the Al-Quds forces and the Zionist occupation forces. So on the surface, taking prisoners seems like it was the main military goal. But the ceasefire, such as it were, is a testament to the fact that taking prisoners wasn't really a means to its own end. If it was supposed to give the resistance forces some degree of leverage to try to stop the inevitable Zionist counterattack that they knew would come, it clearly didn't work. Israel unleashed a genocide on Gaza and killed hundreds of thousands of people, killing some of their own hostages in the process. They didn't care about getting the hostages back. They wanted to use the hostages as a prop to justify completely demolishing Gaza, making it easier to get away with annexing it. And continuing to hold the hostages just helped to bolster the Israeli pretext for continuing to destroy the entire strip. And don't you think Yahya Sinwar, of all people, would have expected that? He spent decades in Israeli prisons. He learned Hebrew so he could study their politics and media closely. He was a man dedicated to understanding his enemy so that he would understand their strengths and weaknesses. Do you really think he would risk the backlash that would come for his people and risk his own life, his family's lives, on a plan that hinged on a coalition of Israel's furthest right parties to calmly trade prisoners for political concessions following the largest Palestinian-led offensive against the Zionist regime ever? Not only was the taking of prisoners not done with the intention of really trading them for anything, I think their taking was almost entirely symbolic. A way to say, we're willing to give back the hostages in exchange for freedom, but they would rather kill their own hostages to get our land than have peace on any terms. Those who fell down the propaganda well and drowned might say,
but what reason do you have to think that there was any greater plan? Wasn't the point just to kill a bunch of people like 9/11?
And let's set aside for a second what a bad reading of Al-Qaeda's goals on 9/11 that is. If incurring as many fatalities was the goal for Hamas, then why take any prisoners? Hamas lost a ton of fighters trying to protect the retreat of their comrades, delivering the prisoners back to Gaza. In fact, I'm not entirely sure that Hamas intended to kill anyone, except for enemy soldiers and armed occupiers capable of resisting. They couldn't retake and hold land on that day. They didn't seem to care about the level of casualties, and the prisoners they took were almost entirely for show, as they were all traded for temporary ceasefires and a bunch of them were already dead by the time of transfer. This all sounds like one really bad plan, if you try to look at things in terms of a single military operation, or just in terms of Palestine versus Israel. We have to look at the big picture. The goal of the Al-Aqsa Flood was to change how the US empire relates to itself, to change how Americans view our own country's support of Israel, to make it untenable for the governments of the Arab states to continue to toe the line for the American and Zionist project in the Middle East, and to finally break the already strained relationship between the US and its European and NATO allies. Over the last 2.5 years, each of these relationships has been strained and permanently altered, but there was still a missing ingredient to causing things to melt down altogether. American skepticism of Israel has grown exponentially, but political realignment allowing anti-Zionism into the mainstream continues to fall short. By all indications, the masses in the Arab states have had their patience pushed to the limit, but revolutionary action to remove a US-backed leader has so far been kept at bay. None of the leaders of those states have changed course either, and the US and Europe have remained in lockstep in support of Zionist atrocities, in spite of the rising animosity of the masses within both. The US and Israelis launching a war to try to overthrow the government of Iran looks like it could be the final straw that causes all of the connective tissue that's been holding this alliance and this empire together to rupture. I think Sinwar and the rest of the leadership of Hamas could have predicted the chain of events that have unfolded, because I think they took the time to really break down and analyze some of the contradictions in this imperial alliance, and how they could ignite all that contradictory accelerant and bring this empire crashing down on top of itself. And the reason you may never have thought about things on this level is because our whole society doesn't, as an order of business, discuss its own reality as an empire in any clear or coherent way. There's a good deal written about the fact that the US is like this, the best of which might be the book Inventing Reality by Michael Parenti. We only really consider foreign policy and mainstream politics and the media as a matter of defining who our enemies are, laying the groundwork for military action against those enemies down the road. We virtually never have real conversations about the relationships within our own sphere, and about what actually holds that sphere together. But this contradictory state of being a massive global empire that tends to obfuscate and deny its role as the center of a global system of dictatorship isn't static. When we look back at US foreign policy since 1945, we can see a lot of shifting phases of public opinion, tending towards interventionism as the groundwork for an attack is being laid in the media and by the government, and then tending back towards isolationism as the costs of those wars set in. New rationalizations and talking points have to be walked out to bolster each new war, and the backlash from those wars weakens those same kinds of claims the next time around until those slogans just turn into jokes.
We're protecting civilians and defending human rights. We're planting the seeds of democracy. They had weapons of mass destruction and they constituted an imminent threat.
Repeated and double-crossed on ad infinitum. And while this cycle of lies has still not produced the deeper understanding and rejection of US empire that we should hope for, it has really shifted what the US military is actually capable of in its conflicts abroad. We saw what a successful imperial occupation looked like after the Second World War. The US didn't just put some boots on the ground in Japan and West Germany and cross their fingers. Permanent military bases were established, and the US spent an astronomical amount of money to rebuild those countries, not just for their own good, but because making them rich, compliant vassal states was the best move to advance US imperial interests. And it's that expenditure on infrastructure that really explains why there was never a major insurgency against the US occupation of the defeated Axis powers. They got a hell of a deal for having lost the bloodiest war of all time, all things considered. A few militant left-wing groups aside, most of the populations of Germany and Japan fell right into line. This is the reality of imperialism. Not even just modern imperialism, but all empires throughout history. Empires always have some hotspots of active resistance, and that's where military action needs to be directed, which means assimilation and integration of defeated foes into the system is crucial for strengthening the empire, even if it comes with some political, social, economic, and cultural conflicts and compromises. Doing this is tricky though because you have to balance a lot of interests. Your own citizens have to be comfortable expanding the definition of what it means to be an imperial citizen, something that Rome struggled with constantly. The citizens of the nations being absorbed into the empire have to feel included enough to feel like they're being treated fairly, or the resentment against the second-class nature of their reality in the empire will breed revolution. And the parasitic classes of each country that are brokering this relationship have to get used to eating off the same plate as one another without fighting over who gets the last jalapeno popper, something the parasite classes of the past and present have always struggled with. Striking the right balance was still pretty difficult to pull off at the height of the New Deal and union power in the US, when many Americans didn't feel too aggrieved at the Japanese and Germans having a whole bunch of infrastructure rebuilt for them, as we had plenty of good infrastructure being built for us at the same time. But as neoliberalism degraded the economic conditions in the US and the UK in particular, the US government and business became less capable of administering any kind of foreign development without making it just a one-sided cash cow, while foreign aid became a huge target for the anti-welfare panic which has sustained the neoliberal movement politically. Western Europe and Japan and South Korea got massive US-sponsored rebuilds to make them outposts for the next struggles for imperial expansion, but even by the war in Vietnam, the US was no longer interested in or capable of recreating these earlier successes. The South Vietnamese puppet regime actually got more money than the entire Marshall Plan when compared in 2025 dollars. But privatization and other factors meant that a lot of what the US spent on Vietnam was ultimately just wasted. Contracts were consistently over budget and under-delivered. South Vietnamese generals sometimes sold their own arms shipments on the illicit market and pocketed the money. Corruption was endemic, and only those in positions of power actually benefited from the flow of US aid. This was a political disaster and a major factor in the US losing the war. Squandering aid meant that the masses in the South had good reason to hate the puppet regime, and many of them joined the liberation forces to overthrow it. Spending billions of dollars to modernize the economy of a puppet state, only for much of it to be lost to corruption, fed the narrative of groups like the Black Panther Party too, who highlighted how much money the US was able to throw around abroad making war, while many black Americans lived in horrible conditions, and while black men were overrepresented in the draft to fight that war. And this was before neoliberalism had even fully taken hold. Fast forward to today, and more Americans than ever see military expenditure in direct odds with the quality of their own healthcare and education and transportation. The weakening of American workers has weakened the country's will to make war abroad, especially when the cost is a large number of US body bags, but they're not really keen on spending a lot of money either, on war or aid. The political stickiness of all these limitations within the US system means that for the past few decades, the US imperial alliance has been held together almost entirely by ideas and very rarely by realities. It's been held together by the idea that the US's security guarantees and web of alliances would stand when tested, but has yet to face any real test that would find out what these promises are made of. The Al-Aqsa Flood was a test designed to expose multiple dimensions of frailty within this system. That was ultimately what Sinwar and Hamas understood. They knew the Arab states have limits in terms of how far Israel can push them before they break. Their own people are largely against their countries having any relationship with Israel, and many of them support the elimination of the Israeli regime, meaning Al-Sisi and Abdullah and Mohammed bin Salman run a larger and larger risk that their own people rise up against them the more they align with and co-sign the Zionist regime's complete degeneration from reality. And by taking an action that would push the Zionist regime into a speedy and unhinged degeneration from reality, Sinwar and the planners of the Al-Aqsa Flood knew these relationships would be tested. And on the other side of the coin from revolution in the Arab states, the Zionist rampage is an existential threat to all those same leaders. In the now widely admitted to plot to create a greater Israel, most recently endorsed by U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee, Egypt and Saudi Arabia would lose most of their territory to Zionist occupation, and Jordan would be completely consumed. And by forcing the Arab states into this crisis, they're also testing whether the U.S.'s security guarantees to the Arab states are actually worth anything. Sinwar knew that Iran and Hezbollah and Ansar Allah would likely get involved in the wake of the flood, and that would risk regional escalation. If Iran happened to fire into Saudi territory, would the U.S. go to any lengths to defend its ally? Well, we found that out in the first week of the U.S.-Iran war. When Saudi Arabia came under rocket attack, the U.S. was busy moving its air defenses west to protect the Zionist regime. It was the British and the French and NATO who made a point to back the Gulf states when the U.S. left them hung out to dry. This shows us that another rift has developed between the U.S. and Europe. A lot of the European leaders seem to really not have wanted the U.S. and Israel to start this war for a bunch of reasons. I think they feared the exodus that could result above all else, especially if the war runs on for a while and Iran collapses into civil war, as anti-immigration politics dominates modern Europe. I think European leaders understand much more than their American counterparts the precariousness of the unpopular US-backed Arab regimes, and fear how far the backlash to this war can be pushed, especially as places like Dubai and Doha experience war for themselves for the first time in ages. There are also fears that this war will spread, pulling the European powers in whether they like it or not. And in the second Trump term, tensions between the US and Europe are the highest they've been since World War II, due to the US's attempts to annex Greenland and make Canada the so-called 51st state. So another dispute over a certain-to-be unpopular war is just another straw on the back of a very tired and weak camel. What do you get when the Europeans don't want to get involved, and the US will devolve into a political crisis if there's more than a few dozen US casualties? A war between the Arab states, especially the Gulf states, and Iran? All those countries combined don't have a large enough force to occupy Iran while also keeping their own home fronts pacified. A ground invasion of Iran would annihilate any army dumb enough to stick its foot into that trap. That leaves a purely aerial war, something that, as we've seen over the past several decades, just does not really have the ability to nail down any concrete results. It's convenient for US politicians because enough Americans are totally passive to bombing campaigns that they have a good deal of leeway to bomb before it becomes a political problem for them. But if you can't actually remove a regime that you want gone or install one that you want in place, it's not actually doing anything other than killing people. If you can get the US trapped into a situation where they have to bring in ground forces, and they don't, or they do, but it's such a calamity that they turn tail and run, the whole US system collapses. At that point, the Arab states realize they're well and truly on their own, and they realign themselves accordingly. And the first thing the Arab states would do if their current leaders stopped groveling to the US or got overthrown in a revolution would be to cut off Israel and to raise the price of oil to astronomical levels. The fact that the Europeans and Americans might split over their attachments to the Arab states or to Israel is just even more gravy on top. Some kind of sequence of events like this was almost certainly Yahya Sinwar's main goal. But how did he see the way things were going to play out so far in advance? And why don't the other players in this game even seem to realize what a trap they've fallen into, even now? A lot of it has to do with the advanced, dementia-like state of imperial brain rot that I call crypto-imperialism. If you're new around here, you might want to go back and check out our last episode called Our Side of the Ledger, which is an intro to the concept of crypto-imperialism. That episode took its title from one of the messages in Pete Hegseth's leaked signal chats pertaining to the US bombing of Yemen in 2025. And the viewpoint that Hegseth is presenting in those messages is pretty on point for the behavior that we're seeing from the Trump administration this year. He saw those US strikes as a favor to Egypt and Europe, for which he thought the US was owed something in exchange, rather than seeing them as something that the US was doing to benefit its entire sphere and above all else itself. The main point of that episode was that the MAGA branch of crypto imperialism seemed to think that not only can they still expect loyalty from allies and vassal states after using them as human shields and hanging them out to dry, that they can also make them pay for the privilege. So if you come away from this episode with more questions about crypto imperialism than I answer here, that's a good place to look further for now. But for the purposes of this episode, I see crypto imperialism as the third phase of empire for the US and for our main allies like Britain and France. First wave imperialism is the loud and proud phrase.
We're superior to everyone else. We can take their land and resources and enslave them as we please because they can't stop us.
This phase of imperialism hits a wall for a few reasons. It's obviously pretty difficult to do this in too many places at once because it requires a lot of brute force to treat people this way and to constantly suppress resistance. So there's really only so far an empire can expand under this model because it simply cannot build an army big enough to manage an empire of this size at this intensity. This kind of empire also unites everyone in the colonies against it. The most powerful classes and influential groups in a colonized society are just as disillusioned under imperialism as the most exploited and marginalized classes. That tends to foment a nationalist movement to liberate all the people of the colony from the colonizer. And that kind of movement is nearly impossible to stop once it gets momentum. Europeans tried to suppress these uprisings, but quickly realized that not only were their crackdowns hardening the resolve of the people revolting, they were encouraging others oppressed by the empire to rise up as well. This led European imperialists to follow the example that the US had set in Latin America in the early 20th century. Let the nationalist movements succeed and try to buy off and control the ruling classes of the new nations. But media also plays a role in breaking down first wave imperialism. The more mass media grows and develops, the harder it gets for an empire to hide the atrocities that it commits to achieve its goals from its own people. And the more obvious it is to the colonized people in different parts of the world that they're all part of the same struggle. The best example of that is the revolutions against the French in the 50s. 100 years earlier, the people of Algeria would have had much less visibility into what the French Empire was doing elsewhere in the world, whether the French were doing well or struggling to quell a revolt in some other colony. But because of the growth of mass media that was occurring at the time, especially the radio, the Algerian independence movement was able to track the French defeat in Indochina in real time. And the launch of the Algerian Revolution just after the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu was no accident. And in that same moment, the French public were much more able to see in real time the atrocities its own army was committing in the colonies, leading to one of the first big waves of domestic opposition to imperial barbarity and war. By the early 60s, this first wave of imperialism was basically dead. This leads to the second wave, neo-imperialism. Neo-imperialism tries to hide the reality of empire by doing two key things. Instead of having an occupying government, a neo-empire deputizes the local ruling class of a colony as its proxy, buying their complicity and obscuring that country's status as a continuing colony. Former Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah called this flag independence in his book Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. National unity and nominal independence is a smokescreen used by neo-imperialism to hide the deep divisions of the newly independent countries. They'll let you have a flag, but they won't give you back the gold mines or the oil wells or the land they stole. The symbolic transfer of political power and legitimacy and laundering the reputability of the new regime with the new flag, anthem, and recognition of nationhood allows people in the colonies and in the imperial core to believe that imperialism is dead, when in reality the extraction of wealth and resources remains almost entirely intact. Even when the people's faith in their local leaders collapses, neo-imperialism masks the real problems, making people think it's this particular puppet or that particular party that's at fault. This leads to endless coups and regional uprisings, civil wars, and wave elections that at the end of the day just replace one proxy with another. Only changing and ultimately defeating the system of extraction can really change the system of government. The other side of the neo-imperial coin is the pacification of the masses on the empire's home front. Telling us that our country is not an empire obviously changes how we relate to that empire. Proxies and puppet states can be seen as willing allies, and our sphere can be portrayed as the free world even while we sponsor a majority of the world's dictatorships. And anyone who steps out of line with the American world order can be vilified, turning the aggressive side of our foreign policy into a comic book, where we're a superhero and whoever we're against is irredeemably evil. This sort of binary logic of good and evil bears a resemblance to first-wave imperialism, but it replaces the European rationalization of the white man's burden and its explicit ideas of racial superiority with an also very delusional idea of absolute moral and cultural superiority. And as that comic book story gets passed from generation to generation, it devolves into a society-wide delusion. And that society-wide delusion is what I call crypto-imperialism, the point at which this pathological denial of empirical imperial reality becomes a feedback loop. The first neo-imperialist knows they're fighting a propaganda war against their major geopolitical adversaries. They keep right on walking the same walk as the first wave imperialists. They're just talking a different talk. The first crypto-imperialist is the one who no longer even understands that there's a difference. The liberal crypto-imperialists start operating as though this morality play, where we're objectively good and only interested in what's best for the world, and our enemies are totally evil and trying to destroy our morality-driven world order, is actually true rather than just a pretext for doing whatever we want to do. The right-wing crypto-imperialists reject this view, but in ways which buy into the delusions of that worldview rather than rejecting its false premises. Instead of recognizing that every foreign policy choice made by the US has always been driven by economic self-interests and the expansion of corporate profits, they look at the US-centered world as a kind of charity, where the US is being ripped off by its allies and proxies. This leads to situations like Pete Hegseth complaining that the US bears too much of the cost of airstrikes, and that Egypt of all countries, one of the most important and most fragile US proxy regimes, should be on the hook instead. This mentality weakens the empire, and also exposes all the cracks that neo-imperialism was developed to try to cover up. But because neo-imperialism is supposed to be invisible, all the rationalizations of why neo-imperialism was necessary to replace first-wave imperialism are very poorly transmitted from one generation to the next. Its great strength, being invisible to those who aren't looking for it, is its greatest weakness too. An imperial society that no longer really understands that it's an empire is going to make a lot of mistakes born out of not being able to read the cards that they're holding. Over time, they developed an ever more convoluted internal logic, because if you don't even understand the game that you're playing, you'll never learn how to play your next hand better than your last one. You're just imagining patterns and acting off your misunderstandings, and each failure adds another layer of hallucinated patterns into the mix. The Trump regime campaigned on rejecting the foreign policy of its predecessors and capitalized politically on the war fatigue that Americans have been feeling for the past 20 years. But they've now rather quickly reversed course on this. They're now acting like their problem with the wars of previous presidents is purely technical. That Bush and Obama and Biden simply weren't strong enough to get the job done, but that Trump, Hegseth, and Rubio, simply by acting like real tough boys, can manage to get a different outcome while facing all the same obstacles. And in their rush to prove themselves tough, they're actually exposing all the fragility in the system. Clinton and Bush and Obama and Biden all wanted to do regime change in Iran too. And for all their other failings, I think they at least understood that the cost of a ground invasion would be much higher than what the US public was willing to tolerate. and that launching a bombardment campaign against Iran would unleash a bunch of the worst problems, like the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and heavy strikes against US allies in the Gulf, without any real chance of changing the government anyway. The Trump regime interpreted this caution as weakness and rushed in to start a war of rockets and drones with Iran, assuming they would crack the Iranian government quickly without the need for a ground invasion. Instead, Iran has poked a hole through the veil of US invincibility, demonstrating that the US and its allies don't even have enough interceptor missiles to go around, and forcing the US to make damning choices about where it's going to focus its defenses, prioritizing the Israelis while leaving the Gulf states exposed. This is a war that cannot be won by air power alone, but it is now a war that must be won by the US in order to sustain its empire. If the US doesn't put boots on the ground, the Arab states, many of whom have already joined BRICS and have decent relationships with Russia and China in particular, will not be able to politically tolerate being a US proxy state anymore, and will likely throw the US military out of its Middle Eastern bases and realign themselves accordingly. But if the US does invade Iran by land, the casualties will be astronomical, much higher than in Iraq and probably higher than Vietnam, a cost Americans are almost universally unwilling to pay, at which point the Arab states might realign anyway, as the US status as the dominant world power would likely be over. By starting this war, the US has gambled the entire future of the empire on the ability of the current, very unpopular administration to coax the country into a war that's likely to result in more than 100,000 US casualties, millions of casualties in Iran and the Middle East as a whole, and trillions of dollars spent. If they fail to do this and either back down from the air war and sue for peace, or have to pull out of a ground invasion due to the immense losses and collapse of discipline in the military, the US empire will lose almost all of its hard power. Because once most of the world realizes that long-term occupation isn't something that the US is even capable of anymore whenever it incurs heavy losses, reasserting control will be nearly impossible. Rather than try to consolidate all my thoughts on the ongoing war with Iran into one massive video, I'm going to make a series of videos called Down in the Flood. In this series, we'll address a bunch of the crypto-imperialist mindsets and habits that have made the US empire fragile, predictable, and ultimately defeatable. For instance, how did the relationship between the US and Europe become so contentious in recent years? And is this war with Iran a breaking point within NATO? How close to the brink has the Al-Aqsa Flood pushed the Arab states? And is US power in the Gulf nearing a collapse? Why does the US government seem to think that lopping the head off of a rival government will just cause everything beneath it to immediately collapse? As though Venezuela or Iran were under some dark curse causing everyone to mindlessly follow the evil leader. And that as soon as the spell is broken, all the henchmen disappear and everything goes back to normal. And why is the US so over-reliant on air power when it has proven over and over and over to be ineffective without some kind of ground component? But for next time, I think we'll start by getting our feet firmly planted in the context of this situation, because I think by telling the story of Iran since about the Second World War, we're really going to be able to see the drift of the US from neo-imperialism into crypto-imperialism. The degeneration of US public consciousness, which was never great anyway, into a completely vacuous and navel-gazing state of delusion like crypto-imperialism is key to understanding how we've ended up with the calamity we're staring down the barrel of right now. So keep following events as they unfold, and we'll be back within the next couple of weeks with the next episode and likely some updates on the war. See y'all later.